The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the crowded downtown sidewalk where expensive cars lined the curbs and designer boutiques stretched toward the cloudless sky, their glass windows reflecting a world of wealth that seemed to exist in a different universe from the one inhabited by those struggling just to survive. Marcus Reeves stepped out of his glossy black sedan, adjusting his tailored navy suit while balancing a gourmet lunch bag from the city's most exclusive restaurant, the kind of place where a single meal cost more than some families spent on groceries in a week. His polished leather shoes clicked against the pavement with the confident rhythm of a man who'd never worried about where his next meal would come from, never experienced the gnawing ache of real hunger, never had to choose between eating and paying rent. He checked his Rolex with practiced efficiency, his mind already racing through the afternoon's schedule of meetings, conference calls, and the endless parade of decisions that came with running a billion-dollar real estate empire. The bustling street around him blurred into background noise, just another forgettable moment in a life defined by achievement and accumulation, by climbing higher and reaching further until the ground below became invisible and irrelevant. He barely noticed the three small figures huddled near the corner, their clothes worn thin and faded from too many washes, their eyes hollow with a hunger that children their age should never know, should never have to carry like a constant weight pressing down on their small shoulders. 8-year-old triplets Devin, Dante, and Desiree watched the billionaire with a practiced observation of children who'd learned early that survival meant paying attention, studying patterns, understanding when opportunity presented itself in a world that rarely offered them any chances at all. Their stomachs twisted painfully from days of eating nothing but stale crackers and tap water, the kind of hunger that went beyond simple discomfort to become a constant companion, a gnawing presence that made it hard to think about anything else, hard to focus on schoolwork or play or any of the normal concerns of childhood. Their mama, Elise, lay sick in their cramped studio apartment 3 blocks away, too weak to move from the sagging mattress that took up most of their living space, too proud to beg for help from neighbors who had barely enough of themselves, and too broke to afford both the medicine that might save her life and the food that would keep her children from starving. The children had made a silent pact that morning while watching their mother's labored breathing, seeing the way her chest rose and fell with obvious effort, noting the grayish tint to her skin that terrified them even though they didn't fully understand what it meant. They would find food today, no matter what it took, no matter what lines they had to cross, because watching their mother fade away while their own stomachs cramped with hunger had become unbearable. They'd never stolen anything before, never crossed that moral line their mama had drawn so firmly in the sand even as their world crumbled around them. But desperation has a way of redrawing boundaries, of making the impossible suddenly seem like the only option, of turning good kids into thieves when the alternative is watching your family slowly starve. Devin, the oldest by 4 minutes and the unofficial leader of their small trio, gave the signal with a slight nod of his head, a gesture so subtle that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. But his siblings understood immediately because they developed their own language of looks and gestures, their own way of communicating that came from being 3 parts of a whole. Desiree moved first, her small body colliding with Marcus with practiced clumsiness that looked completely accidental, the kind of bump that happened all the time on crowded city sidewalks where everyone moved too fast and paid too little attention to the people around them. The impact sent his phone clattering to the sidewalk with a sound that made Marcus curse under his breath, his attention immediately focused on retrieving the expensive device before it could be stepped on or kicked into the street. As the billionaire bent down with an irritated sigh, already mentally calculating whether he'd need to replace the phone or if it had survived the full undamaged, Dante moved with a lightning speed of desperation, snatching the lunch bag with hands that shook from adrenaline and fear. Devin's contribution was almost an afterthought, his fingers closing around the leather wallet that had slipped from Marcus's jacket pocket during the commotion, the weight of it surprising in his small hand. Before Marcus could process what was happening, before his brain could shift from annoyance about his phone to awareness that he'd been robbed, all 3 children scattered like startled birds, their feet pounding against concrete as they disappeared into a narrow alley between 2 towering office buildings, their hearts hammering so hard they could hear nothing else, not the shouts that might have followed them, not the traffic or the pedestrians, or anything except their own terrified. Breathing. Marcus straightened up slowly, phone in hand and apparently undamaged, and realized within seconds that his lunch and wallet were gone, taken by those children who'd already vanished into the urban landscape like smoke dissipating in wind. His first instinct was anger, sharp and immediate, the kind of rage that came from being violated, from having something taken that belonged to him, from the sheer audacity of being robbed in broad daylight on a street where he was known and respected. He opened his mouth to shout, to demand someone call the police, to set in motion the machinery of law enforcement and security that would track down those little thieves and teach them a lesson about stealing from people who had power and resources and connections. But something stopped him, some inexplicable hesitation that he couldn't quite name, that settled over his anger like a blanket smothering flames. Those children's faces flashed through his mind with unexpected clarity, the desperate hunger carved into their young features like words etched in stone, the fear mixed with determination in their eyes that spoke of choices made not from malice but from necessity, the way they'd move with synchronized precision that suggested this wasn't their first desperate act, but rather the latest in a series of survival strategies. Something about them tugged at a memory he couldn't quite grasp, a feeling that settled uncomfortably in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that disturbed the carefully maintained surface of his ordered life. He stood on that sidewalk for a long moment, unusually indecisive for a man known for making million-dollar decisions without hesitation, before finally shaking his head and walking toward his building, his mind troubled by questions he couldn't answer, and a strange sense that this theft meant something more than the loss of a wallet and a gourmet lunch. Deep in the shadowy alley, behind rusted dumpsters that reeked of decay and forgotten cardboard boxes that homeless people had once used for shelter, the triplets finally stopped running, their lungs burning and their legs trembling from exertion and fear and the adrenaline that was slowly beginning to drain from their systems. Their hearts hammered against their ribs like trapped birds desperate to escape, each beat so loud they were certain someone would hear and come investigating, would discover them in their hiding place and drag them off to juvenile detention or wherever it was that they sent children who crossed the line from poverty into crime. Devin carefully opened the lunch bag with trembling hands, his fingers clumsy with nerves and hunger, revealing contents that made all three children gasp with a mixture of awe and desperate longing. Inside sat a gourmet sandwich wrapped in fancy paper that crinkled with quality, stuffed with ingredients they could identify by smell if not by name. Real roast beef, not the processed kind. Fresh vegetables that looked like they'd been picked that morning. Cheese that probably cost more per pound than their mother earned in a day. Fresh fruit gleamed like jewels in the dim light of the alley. Apples so red and perfect they looked artificial. Grapes that were plump and unblemished, a banana without a single brown spot marring its yellow skin. Imported chips they'd only seen in store windows that nestled beside a bottle of sparkling water that probably cost more than their weekly grocery budget, the kind of casual luxury that wealthy people took for granted while others counted pennies to buy the cheapest white bread and store-brand peanut butter. Desiree's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for days, maybe weeks. Tears that came from relief and shame and the overwhelming gratitude of finally having real food in front of them after so long eating scraps and stretching meals and going to bed with stomachs that cramped from emptiness. Dante clutched his stomach as if he could physically contain the hunger clawing at his insides, as if his hands could somehow hold back the desperation that had driven them to this moment, that had turned them into the kind of people their mother had always told them never to become. They divided the food with careful precision that would have made a mathematician proud, each taking equal portions though every instinct screamed at them to devour everything at once, to stuff the food into their mouths as fast as they could swallow, to finally silence the hunger that had become the dominant force in their young lives. The sandwich tasted like heaven, each bite an explosion of flavors they'd almost forgotten existed after months of surviving on whatever cheap food their mother could scrape together from food banks and discount stores, from the clearance section where bread came stamped with expiration dates and dented cans sold for pennies. Desiree ate slowly, forcing herself to savor every morsel while silent tears streamed down her cheeks, tears of relief and shame mixed together in a way that only desperation can create, that only children who've been forced to grow up too fast could truly understand. She thought about her mother lying in that apartment, probably worried sick about where they were, probably too weak to even get out of bed to look for them, probably lying there praying that her babies would come home safe even though she'd sent them out into a dangerous world with nothing but a few dollars and a mother's desperate hope. Dante chewed mechanically, his mind already racing ahead to the bigger problem that no amount of stolen food could solve. What would they eat tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that stretched endlessly ahead like an impossible mountain to climb, each day requiring food and money and resources they simply didn't have. This meal, as wonderful as it was, represented only a temporary reprieve from a permanent problem, a brief moment of fullness in an ocean of hunger that would return as inevitably as a tide. Devin tried to eat with something resembling normalcy, but guilt already gnawed at him worse than hunger ever had. because their mother had raised them better than this, had taught them that stealing was wrong no matter how desperate they became, had instilled values that he'd just betrayed for the price of a sandwich and some fruit. As they reached the bottom of the bag, licking their fingers to capture every last crumb and flavor, Devon's fingers brushed against something hard and leather that definitely wasn't food, that sent a jolt of alarm through his system before his brain even fully processed what he was touching. His stomach dropped as he pulled out the wallet, the reality of what they'd done crashing over him like a wave of ice water, suddenly remembering in the chaos of hunger and fear that they'd taken more than just food, that they'd crossed a line even darker than the one they'd already transgressed. Guilt washed over him in cold waves, because stealing food to feed their dying mother was one thing, something he could almost justify to himself as necessary survival. But taking someone's wallet crossed a line that felt impossible to uncross, that transformed them from desperate children into actual criminals. Desiree gasped when she saw it, her hand flying to her mouth as fresh tears spilled over, these ones born purely from shame rather than relief, from the terrible understanding that they become the kind of people they'd always pitied and feared, the kind who preyed on others, who took what wasn't theirs, who justified theft with necessity. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Would the police come for them? Would they be separated and sent to different foster homes? Would their mother die alone while they were locked up for stealing? Would this single desperate act destroy what little remained of their family? Dante's earlier mechanical chewing stopped completely as he stared at the wallet, his appetite disappearing despite the hunger that still gnawed at his belly, replaced by a sick feeling that spread through his chest like poison. Devon opened the wallet with shaking fingers that could barely grip the leather properly, finding crisp $100 bills that felt almost obscene in their newness, so perfect and clean compared to the crumpled ones and fives they occasionally scraped together, bills that looked like they'd never been touched by hands that worked for a living. Platinum credit cards embossed with names and numbers gleamed in the dim alley light, each one probably carrying a credit limit higher than anything their mother would own in her entire lifetime. A driver's license identified their victim as Marcus Reeves, age 38, resident of an address in the city's most exclusive neighborhood where even the smallest apartments cost more per month than most people earned in a year. They stared at everything with a mixture of temptation and terror, knowing that this cash could buy their mother's medicine, could pay their overdue rent and prevent the eviction notice that had been taped to their door last week, could put real food on their table for weeks instead of the nutritionless carbohydrates they'd been surviving on. The temptation was almost overwhelming, a siren call that promised solutions to every problem that had been crushing them, that whispered they deserved this money because life had been so unfair to them, because their mother was dying and they were starving and surely taking from someone who had so much couldn't really be wrong. But their mama's voice echoed in their heads, steady and firm despite her illness, unwavering even as their world fell apart around them. We don't steal. Babies, we don't take what ain't ours, no matter how hard things get, no matter how desperate we become. We keep our dignity and our souls clean because that's all we got that nobody can take from us. Dante was about to suggest they take just enough of medicine, trying to calculate in his 8-year-old mind what amount would be justifiable, what theft would be acceptable given their circumstances, when Desiree made a small, choked sound that froze both her brothers in place like someone had pressed pause on their entire existence. She was staring at a photograph tucked behind the bills, her face drained of all color until she looked almost as gray as her mother had that morning, her hands trembling so violently the wallet nearly slipped from Devon's grip and scattered its contents across the dainty alley floor. The boys leaned closer and felt their entire world tilt sideways on its axis, felt the ground beneath them become suddenly unreliable, as they recognized the woman in the faded photograph. Their mother, Elise, years younger and radiantly beautiful in a way they'd never seen her, wearing the gold necklace she'd sold 2 months ago to buy their school supplies, smiling with a joy and hope that had disappeared from her face long, before they were old enough to remember seeing it. The photograph was worn around the edges from being handled repeatedly, faded slightly from age and exposure to light, suggesting it had been looked at often, treasured, kept close by someone who valued it enough to carry it every single day for years. Their mother looked happy in the picture, genuinely happy in a way that made the triplets realize they'd never actually seen her truly joyful, only varying degrees of tired, worried, sick, or momentarily relieved when some small crisis was averted or some tiny victory achieved. The alley seemed to spin around them as questions exploded in their minds like fireworks, each one more impossible and terrifying than the last, each one threatening to destroy the fragile understanding they had of their lives and their family and their place in the world. Why did this rich stranger have a mama's picture in his wallet after all these years? What connection existed between the billionaire in the expensive suit and their struggling mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, who never had money for anything beyond the barest necessities, who had been slowly killing herself trying to provide for them? Was this man someone from her past, someone she'd loved and lost, someone who'd broken her heart so badly she'd never spoken about him, never mentioned him even once in all their 8 years of life? The silence her mother maintained about their father had always been absolute, a wall she'd built that they'd learned early never to try to breach, never to ask about because the pain that flickered across her face at even indirect questions was too much to bear. Was this Marcus Reeves the answer to that silence, the reason their mother sometimes cried late at night when she thought they were sleeping, the ghost that haunted her even as she struggled to survive? The weight of that photograph fell heavier than anything they'd ever stolen, heavier than hunger or fear or the crushing poverty that had defined their entire short lives, heavier than all the unanswered questions about why they didn't have a father when other kids did, why their family was incomplete, why they'd always felt like something essential was missing even when they didn't have words to explain what. Devon carefully tucked the photograph back into the wallet and made a decision that would change everything, that would set in motion events none of them could anticipate or control, that would either save their family or destroy what little remained of it. They needed answers, and the only people who could provide them were either their dying mother or the billionaire whose food they just devoured, whose wallet they now held like evidence in a trial where their entire future hung in the balance. Desiree clutched the wallet to her chest while Dante voiced what they were all thinking but were too terrified to say out loud. What if this man was their father, the phantom figure their mother never spoke about, the missing piece of their broken family puzzle, the reason they'd grown up in poverty while he built his empire? The possibility hung in the air between them, terrifying and thrilling in equal measure, offering hope and threatening destruction simultaneously, promising answers while guaranteeing that nothing would ever be the same again regardless of what those answers revealed. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across their hiding place and the city continued its indifferent march forward, the 3 children sat in their alley surrounded by the remnants of their stolen meal, and holding a wallet that might contain the key to understanding everything about their lives, everything about why they'd suffered, everything about the father who'd either abandoned them deliberately or never known they existed at all. Back at Marcus Reeves's penthouse office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of a city he'd conquered through ambition and ruthlessness, the billionaire found himself unable to focus on the quarterly report spread across his mahogany desk, their numbers and projections suddenly meaningless in the wake of an encounter that had shaken something loose in his carefully constructed world. His mind kept returning to those 3 children, their synchronized movements that spoke of deep connection and shared purpose, their identical features that marked them as triplets in a way that couldn't be mistaken, and most disturbingly, the nagging sensation that he'd seen those faces before in some half-remembered dream or deeply buried memory. He'd built his real estate empire on instinct, on reading people and situations with the uncanny accuracy that separated successful businessmen from failed ones, on trusting his gut even when logic suggested a different course, and every instinct now screamed that this wasn't a random street theft but something far more significant, something that connected to his own past in ways he couldn't yet comprehend but that filled him with an inexplicable dread. The children had been desperate, that much was obvious, but there had been something else in their eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, as if they'd known who he was even before they'd stolen from him. The thought was absurd, impossible, and yet it lodged in his mind like a splinter he couldn't remove, irritating and persistent, demanding attention he didn't want to give it. His assistant knocked softly before entering with his afternoon coffee, the ritual that usually marked his transition from morning meetings to afternoon strategy sessions, noting the distant expression on her boss's face with barely concealed concern because she'd worked for Marcus Reeve for 7 years and had never seen him so obviously distracted. Marcus rarely showed emotion, maintaining the cool facade that had made him legendary in boardrooms across the country, the ice-cold control that let him negotiate million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, the reputation for being utterly unflappable that made competitors fear him and allies trust him. But today something had cracked that carefully maintained armor, had gotten under his skin in a way that business rivals and personal challenges never had shaken him in a manner that was visible even to someone who'd learned to read his subtle tells. He waved away the reports she prepared, the ones that usually commanded his complete attention, that usually generated the strategic decisions that kept his empire growing and his competitors scrambling to keep up. Instead, he found himself doing something completely unprecedented, asking his assistant to pull up any information about families living in poverty near the downtown area where the theft occurred, specifically families with 8-year-old triplets, though he couldn't articulate why that detail felt so urgently important, why it seemed to matter in ways that went beyond recovering his stolen wallet. His assistant's eyebrows rose with surprise, but she was professional enough to simply nod and promise to look into it, to dig through databases and city records and social services information in search of data that had nothing to do with real estate or profit margins or any of the usual concerns that dominated Marcus Reeves's carefully scheduled days. Meanwhile, across the city in a fifth-floor walk-up where the elevator never worked and tenant had to climb stairs that reeked of urine and despair, where the hallways smelled of mildew and broken dreams and poverty that had soaked into the walls over decades, Elise Carter lay on a sagging mattress fighting for every painful breath, each inhalation a struggle that took more energy than she had to spare. At 34, she looked a decade older, her body ravaged by an illness she couldn't afford to properly diagnose, let alone treat, her skin hanging loose on bones that had become too prominent, her eyes sunken into dark circles that spoke of pain and exhaustion and the slow surrender of someone fighting a losing battle. She'd sent her babies out that morning with the last few dollars she had, money she'd been saving for rent but had decided food was more urgent, telling them to buy bread and milk and maybe some peanut butter if there was enough money left over, never imagining they'd return with stories of theft and danger and choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The mother's intuition that had guided her through 9 years of single parenthood, through countless crises and close calls and moments when survival seemed impossible, now rang alarm bells she was too weak to fully hear, warning her that something significant had shifted, that her carefully maintained secrets were about to explode into the open. She'd built her entire life around keeping those secrets, around protecting her children from truths that would complicate their already difficult existence, around maintaining the lie that their father was simply gone rather than explaining the complicated reality that he'd never known about them, that she deliberately kept them hidden, that she'd chosen this poverty over the messiness of forcing him to acknowledge children conceived during an affair with a married man. When the triplets finally returned home, bursting through the door with flushed faces and wild eyes and the desperate energy of children who'd crossed lines they'd never imagined crossing, Elise knew immediately that something had gone terribly wrong, that her worst fears were somehow manifesting even though she didn't yet know the specific details. Devon approached her bedside first, his young face showing determination and fear in equal measure, placing the stolen wallet in her trembling hands while his siblings crowded close, their words tumbling over each other in a rushed confession of hunger, desperation, theft, and the shocking discovery inside the leather folds that had turned their world upside down. Elise's face went from confusion to recognition to absolute horror in the space of seconds as she saw Marcus Reeves's name on the driver's license, as memories crashed over her like waves she'd been holding back for 9 years, as she saw her own younger face smiling from that treasured photograph he'd somehow kept all these years despite everything that had happened between them, despite their affair ending in lies and heartbreak and her deliberate disappearance. Her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped the wallet, her breathing becoming even more labored as panic joined the physical illness that was slowly killing her, as the carefully separated compartments of her life suddenly crashed together in a catastrophic collision she'd spent years trying to prevent. The photograph especially destroyed her, because she thought he would throw it away after she disappeared, thought he'd hate her for vanishing without explanation, thought their affair had meant more to her than to him, and that he'd moved on without looking back. But he'd kept her picture, had carried it in his wallet every single day for 9 years, and that knowledge broke something in her heart that had never properly healed from their separation. The room fell silent except for Elise's ragged breathing and the distant sounds of the city filtering through paper-thin walls that did nothing to block out the constant noise of urban poverty, the sirens and arguments and music that formed the soundtrack to their lives. The children watched their mother's face cycle through emotions they couldn't name but could feel, emotions that seemed to age her even further before their eyes, that transformed her from their strong mama into someone fragile and broken and terrified. With a voice that cracked like breaking glass, each word clearly costing her precious energy she didn't have to spare, Elise finally spoke the truth she'd buried for nearly a decade, the secret she'd sworn to carry to her grave to protect both her children and herself from complications she'd decided they were better off not knowing. That man, Marcus Reeves, the billionaire whose food they'd stolen and whose wallet they now held, was indeed their father, the man who'd promised her forever and then vanished when she needed him most, though the reality was more complicated than that simple narrative suggested. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain, tried to make them understand decisions that even she wasn't sure she understood anymore, tried to justify choices that had seemed so clear at the time but now appeared selfish and short-sighted in the harsh light of hindsight. She'd loved him completely, desperately, with a kind of all-consuming passion that makes young people do foolish things, and he claimed to love her the same way, had promised to leave his sick wife and build a life with Elise, had sworn their love was worth any sacrifice. But promises made in the heat of passion often dissolve when faced with cold reality, when death and guilt and social pressure enter the equation, and Marcus had ultimately chosen to stay with his dying wife rather than abandon her for the mistress who had become inconveniently pregnant. The triplets stood frozen as their mother's words painted a picture of their origins that was nothing like the vague stories she'd told them before, nothing like the gentle lies about their father being a good man who'd simply had to leave for reasons beyond anyone's control. The truth was messier, more painful, filled with adult complications they were too young to fully process but old enough to understand was serious, life-altering, irreversible. Devon asked the question that mattered most. Did their father know about them? Had he made a conscious choice to abandon his children? Or had their mother kept them hidden? Elise's face crumpled as she admitted the truth she was most ashamed of, the decision that had haunted her every day for 9 years. Marcus didn't know, had never known, because she'd discovered her pregnancy the same week she'd learned his wife had terminal cancer, and she'd made the impossible choice to disappear rather than force him to choose between his dying wife and his unborn children. She'd changed her name, moved across the city, cut off all contact, and convinced herself she was being noble, being selfless, protecting everyone from an impossible situation. But as the years passed and poverty ground them down, as she watched her children suffer from lack of resources that their father could have easily provided, as her own health failed from stress and malnutrition and untreated illness, she'd begun to question whether her choice of being noble or just cowardly, whether she protected everyone or just made everyone suffer unnecessarily. Now, holding his wallet and seeing that photograph, knowing he'd carried her picture all these years, she wondered if he would have chosen them, would have found a way to be there for his children, would have made different choices if only he'd known they existed. The revelation hit the triplets like a physical blow, stealing their breath and making the cramped apartment feel even smaller, as if the walls were closing in to suffocate them with the weight of this impossible truth, as if the very air had become too heavy to breathe properly. Desiree was the first to find her voice, asking the question that burned in all their hearts with a pain that went beyond their physical hunger, beyond their fear of poverty, touching something deeper and more fundamental about their identity and worth. Why had their father abandoned them? And if he hadn't known about them, why hadn't their mother told him? Why had she made the choice to keep them secret, to raise them in poverty when their father apparently had the wealth to give them? Everything they lacked? Her voice rose with each question, not quite accusing but definitely hurt, definitely confused, definitely demanding answers that would make sense of a childhood defined by struggle and lack, and watching their mother slowly die from an illness that money could have treated. Elise closed her eyes against the accusation in her daughter's voice, knowing she owed them explanations but lacking the strength to provide them in any coherent way, her body failing even as her heart broke for the childhood innocence she'd just shattered, for the simple understanding of their world she'd just complicated beyond repair. She'd always known this day might come, had rehearsed explanations in her head during sleepless nights, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of seeing confusion and betrayal written across her children's young faces, for understanding that her choices had harmed them in ways she'd never fully acknowledged, for facing the possibility that her attempt to protect everyone had actually just hurt the people she loved most. Devon, always a protector despite his young age and small stature, made a decision with a fierce determination that had kept his family alive through their darkest times, that had made him grow up faster than any child should have to, that had transformed him from a carefree kid into a miniature adult carrying responsibilities that would break most grown men. They would return the wallet, he declared with a firmness that surprised even himself. They would march straight to Marcus Reeves's office and demand answers, demand support, demand everything he owed them for 9 years of absence, whether that absence had been intentional or not, whether he'd known about them or whether their mother's choices had kept them hidden. Dante agreed immediately, his anger at their absent father bubbling over into reckless courage that overrode his natural caution, his usual tendency to think things through before acting replaced by a desperate need to confront the man whose absence had shaped their entire lives. While Desiree clutched her mother's hand and begged her to tell them everything, to explain how a love story had become a tragedy of abandonment and poverty, to make them understand the choices that had led to this moment where they lived in a falling-apart apartment while their father lived in luxury across town. The questions came faster than Elise could answer them, piling up like accusations even though the children didn't mean them that way. Simply trying to understand a situation that seemed designed to be incomprehensible, trying to make sense of adult decisions that had stolen their chance at a normal childhood. through labored breaths and tears that carved rivers down her gaunt cheeks, leaving trails that glistened in the dim light of their apartment. Elise told him the truth about the passionate affair with a man she thought was single, about the whirlwind romance that had felt like destiny, about falling completely and irrevocably in love with someone who seemed too good to be true and turned out to be exactly that. She explained how she'd discovered his marriage only after she'd fallen completely in love, after she'd already given him her heart and her body and her complete trust, the betrayal cutting deeper because she believed every lie he'd told, every promise he'd made, every declaration that she was his everything and his forever. She'd been young and naive, working as a waitress at an upscale restaurant where Marcus had been a regular customer, and his attention had felt like sunlight after a lifetime of shadows, his interest in her like a miracle she'd done nothing to deserve. He'd pursued her with the same focus and intensity he brought to business deals, had made her feel special and valued and worthy of love in a way no one ever had before. She'd asked about his personal life, had explicitly confirmed he was single before agreeing to date him, and he'd lied smoothly and completely, had constructed an entire false narrative about being a divorced workaholic who'd thrown himself into building his business after his marriage failed. She believed him because she'd wanted to, because being with him had felt so right that questioning it seemed impossible, because love makes people stupid and blind and willing to overlook warning signs they'd normally catch immediately. She continued, her voice breaking as she described the day everything fell apart, the moment she discovered the truth in the most painful way possible. Seeing him with his wife at a charity gala, watching him touch her with tenderness, hearing him introduce her as the love of his life to people who'd asked, understanding in one crushing moment that everything he'd told Elise had been a lie. His wife hadn't been an ex-wife but a current wife, and not just any wife but a woman dying of cancer, fighting for her life while her husband conducted an affair with a waitress he'd seduced with practiced lies. Elisa confronted him later, had raged and cried and demanded to know why he'd lied to her, why he'd made her complicit in his betrayal, why he'd destroyed her trust and her dignity and her sense of being a good person. He'd claimed he loved them both, had said his marriage was essentially over even if the paperwork wasn't finalized, had promised he'd been planning to tell her the truth but hadn't found the right moment, had sworn he was going to leave his wife after she finished her cancer treatment. The excuses had sounded hollow even then. The promises felt empty. But Elise had wanted desperately to believe him because the alternative was accepting she'd been nothing but a fool and a mistress, that her grand romance had been nothing but a married man's affair, that everything she thought was real had been a lie from the very beginning. She'd discovered her pregnancy 2 weeks later, had planned to tell him immediately despite everything that had happened, had even rehearsed what she'd say and how she'd say it, believing maybe a baby would force him to make good on his promises, would give him the push he needed to finally leave his wife and build a real life with Elise. But then she'd seen them together again, Marcus and his wife, and the woman had looked so frail and sick, so clearly dying, her body ravaged by chemotherapy and radiation, her hand clutching her husband's like he were the only thing keeping her tethered to life. Elise had watched from across the street as Marcus helped his wife into their car with infinite gentleness, had seen the way he looked at her with something that might have been love or might have been guilt or might have been both, and she'd realized in that moment that she couldn't tell him about the pregnancy, couldn't force him to choose between his dying wife and his pregnant mistress, couldn't be the woman who destroyed whatever piece that dying woman had left. So she disappeared instead, had changed her name from Elise Montgomery to Elise Carter, had moved to a different neighborhood where she wouldn't accidentally run into him, had gotten a new job and a new apartment and tried to build a new life without him. She'd told herself she was being noble, being selfless, protecting everyone from an impossible situation, but the truth was she'd also been protecting herself from rejection, from the possibility that he'd choose his wife over her and their unborn children, from the humiliation of being the mistress who'd gotten pregnant and tried to force a man to leave his dying wife. The months had turned to years, and she'd never reached out, had never told him what he was missing, had raised their children alone while he built his empire, had watched from a distance as his life continued on its trajectory while he spiraled downward into poverty and illness and regret that maybe she'd made the wrong choice. Maybe she should have told him. Maybe her pride and her fear had stolen her children's chance at having a father who could have loved them and provided for them and given them the life they deserved. The children listened with faces that aged before their mother's eyes, their childhood innocence burning away in the harsh light of adult complications and moral ambiguities that shouldn't concern 8-year-olds but had become their problem to navigate nonetheless. They learned that Marcus never knew about the pregnancy, that Elise had hidden from him deliberately and systematically, that she'd changed her name and disappeared so completely that even someone with his resources couldn't have found her if he'd tried, though they'd never know if he'd actually looked for her after she vanished. Devon asked if their father had ever tried to find her, if he'd cared enough to search when she disappeared, and Elise had to admit she didn't know, had never checked, had been too afraid of what she might discover, either that he'd looked and failed to find her, which would prove her erasure of herself had been too complete, or that he hadn't looked at all, which would prove she'd never really mattered to him beyond being convenient or fair. Desiree wanted to know if her mother still loved him, if the feelings that had created them were still alive after all these years, and Elise couldn't answer that question honestly without admitting true she'd barely acknowledged herself, that seeing his face on that driver's license had made her heart skip in a way it hadn't in 9 years, that knowing he'd kept her photograph suggested he might have cared more than she believed, that some part of her had been waiting for him to find her, even while she'd made it impossible for him to do so. Dante demanded to know if their father was a good man or a bad man, if they should hate him for abandoning them or forgive him for not knowing they existed, and Elise realized she couldn't answer that question either, because Marcus Reeves had been both and neither, had been a man who'd lied about his marriage but had also stayed loyal to his dying wife, had been passionate and attentive with Elise but had also been conducting an affair while his wife fought cancer, had been too complicated and human to fit into the simple categories of good or bad that children needed to make sense of their world. As night fell over the city and the apartment grew dark because they couldn't afford to pay the electricity bill that had been overdue for 2 months, the family made a collective decision that would alter the trajectory of all their lives in ways none of them could anticipate or control. They would confront Marcus together, return his wallet, show him the children he never knew existed, and demand he take responsibility for the family he'd unknowingly abandoned. Elise protested weakly, terrified of facing the man she'd once loved with every fiber of her being, the man whose absence had carved a hole in her heart that 9 years hadn't managed to heal, terrified of seeing his face again and feeling all those old feelings resurface, terrified of his reaction to learning he had 3 children he'd never met, terrified of rejection or indifference or worst of all, anger that she'd kept them from him. But her children's determination overrode her fear and shame, their need for answers stronger than a desire to keep hiding from the past, their right to know their father more important than her pride or her fear or her complicated feelings about the man who'd lied to her but whom she'd never completely stopped loving. Devon declared they'd go first thing in the morning, that they'd march into his fancy office building and demand an audience, that they wouldn't leave until he acknowledged them and explained what came next. Dante insisted they wouldn't back down or be intimidated by his wealth or his power, that they deserved answers and support regardless of how awkward or uncomfortable the situation became. Desiree made her mother promise to come with them despite her illness, because this was something they needed to face as a family, all 4 of them together confronting the man who'd shaped their lives through his absence, demanding he finally see what his choices, both the ones he'd made knowingly and the ones that had been made for him, had created. The next morning arrived gray and threatening, the sky heavy with storm that matched the tempest in their hearts as the Carter family prepared for a confrontation that would either save them or destroy what little remained of their fragile existence. Elise could barely walk, her illness having worsened overnight from the stress and emotion of the previous day's revelations, leaning heavily on Devon while her other children flanked her like tiny bodyguard who was simultaneously terrified and determined. The stolen wallet remained clutched in Dante's sweating palm like evidence in a trial where their entire future hung in the balance, where one man's reaction would determine whether they continued struggling in poverty or gained access to resources that could transform their lives. They must have looked like ghosts as they made their way downtown on the bus because they couldn't afford a taxi, their shabby clothes and desperate faces drawing stares from other passengers who quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the visible poverty that reminded them how close any of them could be to the same fate. Elise's breathing was labored and painful, each step clearly costing her energy she didn't have to spare, but she refused to turn back or delay this confrontation another day, knowing she might not have another day to wait, that her health was deteriorating so rapidly that she could feel her body shutting down, preparing for an end she wasn't ready to accept because her children still needed her. When they finally reached Reeves Tower, that gleaming monument to wealth and success that seemed to pierce the stormy sky like a declaration of triumph over poverty and struggle, the building's sheer size and obvious expense intimidated them in ways they tried to prepare for but couldn't quite achieve. The lobby was a cathedral of capitalism, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and the kind of quiet, controlled atmosphere that made their every breath feel too loud, too intrusive, too obviously out of place. They must have looked like ghosts or perhaps refugees from another world as they entered this gleaming space, their shabby clothes and desperate faces completely out of place among the marble floors and crystal chandeliers that screamed wealth beyond their wildest imaginings, among the well-dressed business people who moved with the confidence of people who'd never worried about where their next meal would come from or whether they could afford to turn on the heat. Desiree pressed closer to her mother, suddenly frightened by the massive space and the strangers who stared at them with expressions ranging from pity to disgust to carefully maintained indifference. Dante's grip tightened on the wallet until his knuckles turned white, while Devon stood taller, trying to project a confidence he absolutely didn't feel, trying to look like he had every right to be there even though everything about the building said people like them weren't welcome, weren't wanted, weren't supposed to exist in spaces as clean and expensive and carefully controlled. Security stopped them immediately, of course, because people like them didn't belong in buildings like this, didn't have any legitimate business among the lawyers and executives and millionaires who populated this vertical slice of the upper class. A uniformed guard who probably earned more in a month than Elise made in 3 approached them with a mixture of professional courtesy and obvious suspicion, his hand resting casually but meaningfully near the baton at his belt. Devon spoke with a clarity and authority that belied his 8 years, demanding to see Marcus Reeves on urgent personal business, his young voice not wavering despite the fear that threatened to choke him, despite every instinct that screamed they should run before someone called the police or social services or some other authority that had the power to separate their family. The guard's expression hardened as he pulled out his radio, clearly about to call for backup or possibly the police, when a private elevator at the far end of the lobby opened with a soft chime that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden tension. Marcus himself emerged, his eyes scanning the lobby in distraction before landing on the small family huddled near the security desk, before truly seeing them and feeling his entire world stop spinning, before recognition slammed into him like a freight train traveling at impossible speed, before understanding crashed over him with a force of revelation that changes everything, that redraws reality, that makes the world before this moment seem like a dream compared to the sharp, undeniable truth of what he was seeing. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met across the lobby, years of pain and longing and unanswered questions crackling between them like electricity arcing between 2 points that had been forcibly separated, that had been desperately wanting to reconnect even while distance and time and deliberate choices had kept them apart. Marcus's carefully constructed world tilted violently off its axis as he processed the children's ages, their identical features that marked them unmistakably as triplets, the way they stood protectively around Elise whose face he'd memorized a decade ago and had never been able to forget despite trying, despite moving on, despite telling himself she'd simply been an affair that ended badly rather than the love of his life who'd mysteriously vanished. He saw their ages first, 8 years old, maybe 9, the math clicking into place with horrible, wonderful clarity, and then he really looked at their faces and felt the breath leave his body as he recognized his own features reflected back at him in miniature, his nose on Devon's face, his eyes on Dante, his mouth and chin on Desiree, genetic evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away or dismissed as coincidence. These were his children, the family he never knew existed, standing before him in the lobby of his tower like ghosts materializing from the might-have-been dreams that had tormented him for nearly a decade, like answers to questions he'd stopped asking because they hurt too much, like the family he convinced himself he didn't deserve after the lies he'd told and the choices he'd made. Dante stepped forward with the wallet extended in shaking hands, his voice trembling but clear as he announced they'd come to return what they'd stolen and to meet the father who'd abandoned them before they were even born, his words carrying across the quiet lobby and causing several people to stop and stare openly, business forgotten in the face of this obvious drama. The lobby erupted in whispers and stays, dozens of strangers suddenly finding this family crisis far more interesting than their own concerns. But Marcus heard nothing except the roaring in his ears, so nothing except Elise's face drained of color, felt nothing except the crushing weight of 9 lost years and 3 children who bore his features and had grown up in poverty while he'd built an empire, while he'd mourned the loss of the woman he'd loved and convinced himself he'd never see again. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, his expensive shoes clicking against marble that suddenly seemed less like a monument to his success and more like evidence of how far he'd risen while his own children had struggled at the bottom, ignoring the wallet entirely because whatever contained was meaningless compared to what stood before him. His hands reached toward the children with a hunger that matched their own desperation from the previous day, a need to touch them and confirm they were real and not just another dream that would dissolve when he woke, a desperate yearning to somehow erase 9 years of absence with a single embrace even though he knew that was impossible, that some distances couldn't be crossed instantly no matter how much you wanted to close them. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of DNA tests that confirmed what everyone already knew, their genetic connection undeniable and scientifically verified even though no one who looked at the triplets next to Marcus could doubt their relationship. Legal consultations followed as lawyers argued about custody and child support, and whether Elise could be charged with fraud for hiding the children, or whether Marcus could claim any rights given that he'd never been informed of their existence. Medical appointments dominated their schedule as Marcus insisted on getting Elise the best treatment available, bringing in specialists from across the country to examine her and develop a treatment plan, learning that her condition was serious but potentially manageable if she received proper care and medication that her poverty had made impossible to access. The children moved into Marcus's penthouse temporarily, their mother too sick to care for them while undergoing intensive treatment, the transition jarring and uncomfortable as they tried to adapt to luxury after a lifetime of poverty, tried to trust a father they'd just met, tried to understand how their lives had changed so completely in such a short time. Marcus threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to building his business, determined to make up for lost time even while knowing that was impossible, that you couldn't recover 9 years no matter how many resources you threw at the problem, that his children were strangers to him and he to them despite their genetic connection. But it wasn't easy, wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything suddenly became perfect because a rich father appeared and waved his money to fix all problems. The children resented him even while depending on him, angry at his absence even while knowing rationally that he hadn't known about them, struggling with feelings they couldn't articulate about whether to hate him or love him or something more complicated than either. Devin especially kept his distance, refusing to call Marcus Dad, maintaining a wall of formality that hurt more than outright hostility would have because it suggested complete emotional detachment, suggested he'd written Marcus off as someone who'd arrived too late to matter. Dante vacillated wildly between clinging to Marcus desperately and pushing him away with anger, his emotions too big and complicated for his young body to contain, erupting in tantrums and tears that confused everyone including himself. Desiree tried to be the peacemaker, trying to make everyone happy, trying to hold together a family that had been broken before it ever properly formed, the weight of that responsibility crushing for an 8-year-old who just wanted parents who loved each other and loved her without all this complicated history and pain. Marcus and Elise navigated their renewed relationship with even more difficulty, neither knowing quite how to be around the other, their history too complicated to simply set aside but too painful to address directly. She was grateful for the medical care that was saving her life, grateful for the security and resources that meant her children would never be hungry again, but she also resented needing his help, resented that he'd lived in luxury while she'd struggled, resented that fate had brought them back together only after she'd nearly died and her children had been forced to steal. He wanted to be angry at her for hiding his children, for depriving him of 9 years of their lives, for making him miss their first words and first steps and every milestone that he'd never get back, but he couldn't quite manage sustained anger because he understood why she'd done it, because he'd been the one who'd lied about his marriage in the first place, because his choices had created the situation that had forced her to make impossible decisions. They moved around each other carefully. Former lovers turned co-parents turned something neither could quite name, attraction and resentment and shared history creating a tension that filled every room they occupied together. The turning point came 3 months into this new arrangement, when Elise was finally strong enough to leave the hospital and face a future that looked nothing like the one she'd imagined when she'd disappeared 9 years ago. Marcus offered her a suite in his penthouse, separate living space where she could recover while remaining close to the children, the offer practical and generous and also terribly awkward given their history. She accepted because she had no other options, because her old apartment had been vacated and a few belongings sold or thrown away, because she had no job and no savings and nowhere else to go, the acceptance bitter even though she was grateful, another reminder of how completely her life depended on the man who'd once been her lover and was now something like a stranger who happened to be the father of her children. They established routines and boundaries, careful rules about their interactions that made the living situation tolerable if not comfortable, agreements about the children's care and education and future that required them to communicate regularly even though every conversation felt loaded with subtext and unfinished business. One evening, After the children were asleep and the penthouse was quiet except for the ambient sound of the city far below, Marcus found Elise standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows staring out at a skyline she'd once viewed from street level, looking at a city that had chewed her up and nearly spit her out but had also given her 3 incredible children and now, unexpectedly, a second chance. He approached slowly, maintaining the careful distance they'd established, standing beside her but not too close, close enough to talk but far enough to preserve the boundaries that kept their interaction safe and defined. They stood in silence for a long moment before Marcus finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion he'd been holding back for months, asking the question that had haunted him since that morning in the lobby when his whole world had changed. Why hadn't she told him about the pregnancy? Why had she disappeared so completely? Why had she chosen poverty and struggle over forcing him to take responsibility for his children? The questions came out more accusatory than he'd intended, years of hurt and confusion sharpening his words into weapons even though he'd promised himself he'd stay calm. He'd be understanding. He wouldn't let his own pain make this conversation harder than it needed to be. Elise turned to face him, and for the first time since a reunion allowed him to see past the careful mask she'd been maintaining, let him see the pain and regret and complicated grief that had defined her last 9 years, let him see how much his lies had cost her even though she'd also paid willingly, had made choices that had compounded the damage rather than minimized it. She explained again, more fully than she had before, about seeing him with his dying wife and understanding she couldn't insert herself and their unborn children into that situation, about believing she was being noble even while recognizing she was also being a coward, about how the months had turned to years and the longer she waited the harder it became to reach out, until eventually it felt impossible, until the secret had calcified into something solid and immovable that she'd built her entire identity around keeping. She told him about the times she'd almost called, about the night she cried while watching their babies sleep and wishing he could see them, about the birthdays and holidays and milestones she documented obsessively in photographs and journals because some part of her had always believed that someday he'd want to see what he'd missed, that someday she'd find the courage to show him what his lies and her pride had stolen from both of them. She admitted she'd made mistakes, that her choices had hurt everyone including herself, that if she could go back she wasn't even sure what she'd do differently because every option had seemed impossible at the time, because there are some situations where every choice is wrong and you just have to pick which wrong feels least damaging. Marcus listened with tears streaming down his face that he didn't bother to wipe away, his usual control completely abandoned in the face of truths that hurt precisely because they were so human, so understandable, so completely without villains even though there had been so much damage. He admitted his own failures, his lies about being single when they started their affair, his weakness in conducting a relationship with Elise while his wife was dying, his choice to stay in his marriage even after his wife passed away rather than looking for Elise and trying to salvage what they'd had. He'd told himself he was honoring his late wife's memory by not immediately running back to his mistress, but the truth was he'd also been afraid of facing Elise's anger about his lies, afraid of admitting he'd been too weak to leave his dying wife, afraid of the guilt that consumed him whenever he thought about the happiness he'd stolen by conducting an affair while his wife fought cancer. So he'd thrown himself into his business instead, had built an empire because building something felt better than facing what he'd destroyed, had kept Elise's photograph in his wallet like a talisman or punishment, looking at it regularly but never quite finding the courage to actually search for her, to demand answers about why she'd disappeared, to risk learning that she'd left because she'd decided he wasn't worth the complications he'd brought into her life. They talked through the night, years of silence and misunderstanding slowly giving way to honest communication, to acknowledgement of failures and forgiveness that felt earned rather than easy, to the beginning of something that wasn't quite their old love but wasn't entirely different either. The sun was rising when they finally ran out of words, when confession and recrimination and understanding had exhausted them both, leaving them standing together in the quiet penthouse with a new day dawning outside and something tentatively hopeful beginning inside. Marcus reached for Elise's hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and felt something loosen in his chest when she let him take it, when her fingers curled around his with a grip that suggested she was as tired of being apart as he was, that maybe they could find a way forward that honored their past without being destroyed by it. They didn't kiss, didn't declare love or make promises about the future, just stood together holding hands and watching the sunrise and feeling for the first time in 9 years that maybe, possibly, with a lot of work and patience and willingness to forgive both themselves and each other, this broken family might actually find a way to become whole. The children found them like that an hour later, standing together and holding hands, and something in all three young faces softened with hope they'd been afraid to feel, hope that maybe they could have what other children took for granted. Two parents who loved each other and loved them, a family that was whole instead of fractured, a future that didn't require them to choose between their mother and their father but let them have both. Devon approached first, always the bravest despite his reservations, asking quietly if this meant they were going to be a real family now, if Marcus was really going to stay, if their mother was going to be okay. Marcus knelt down to his son's level and made promises he intended to keep, promises about being present and involved and never voluntarily leaving again, promises about making sure Elise got whatever medical care she needed for as long as she needed it, promises about learning to be the father he should have been from the beginning even though he'd lost so much time. Dante joined them next, his anger finally giving way to the desperate need for a father he'd been hiding behind his rage, letting Marcus hug him properly for the first time, crying into his father's shoulder with a kind of abandon that only children can achieve, releasing months of pain and fear and confusion in great heaving sobs that Marcus absorbed while making soothing sounds and stroking his son's back and feeling his own heart break and heal simultaneously. Desiree completed the family circle, wrapping her arms around both her brothers and her father, declaring in her clear young voice that they were going to be okay now, that they were finally going to be the family they were always supposed to be, the certainty in her tone making it feel almost like a promise, like something she could manifest through sheer force of will and hope. Elise watched her children embrace their father and felt the loss of her resistance crumble, felt the fear and pride that had kept her separate finally dissolve, leaving her free to join the family circle, to let Marcus's arm wrap around her waist, to lean into his strength instead of always fighting to maintain her own independence, to finally accept that needing help wasn't weakness and accepting love wasn't surrender. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, this family that had been broken before it properly began, this collection of people bound by biology and hurt and now, tentatively, by choice and forgiveness and hope. The road ahead would be complicated and difficult, full of therapy and difficult conversations and the hard work of building trust that had been destroyed and learning to function as a family unit when they'd all been separate for so long. The children would struggle with their feelings about their father's absence and their mother's choices, would need time and patience, professional help to process trauma that no children should have to carry. Marcus and Elise would have to navigate their renewed relationship carefully, would have to decide if they were co-parents or something more, would have to balance their history with their present and figure out what future they wanted to build together. But standing there in that penthouse with the morning sun painting everything gold, with three children who'd stolen food because they were starving finally held safe in their father's arms, with a mother who'd nearly died from poverty finally getting the medical care that would save her life, with a father who'd missed 9 years finally given the chance to be present for whatever came next. Standing there together, they all felt something they hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The real kind. The earned kind. The kind that acknowledges how broken things have been while believing they can be repaired. The kind that doesn't promise easy solution but commits to doing the hard work anyway. Desiree looked up at her parents and smiled, declaring with the absolute certainty of childhood that everything was going to be okay now, that they were going to be a real family, that the hard times were finally over. And while the adults knew it wasn't quite that simple, that recovery and reconciliation would take years and would never be complete, that some wounds would always ache even after they healed, they didn't correct her. Because sometimes children see truth that adults have lost the ability to recognize. Sometimes hope is more powerful than cynicism, and sometimes families that have been shattered can find ways to reassemble themselves into something different than they were, but no less real, no less valuable, no less worthy of the love and effort and forgiveness that holds people together when everything else tries to tear them apart. 6 months later, the penthouse had transformed from Marcus's bachelor space into something that actually looked like a home, with children's toys in corners and family photos on walls and the beautiful chaos that comes from 3 energetic children filling previously empty spaces with life and noise and joy. Elise's health had stabilized dramatically with proper medical care and nutrition, her body slowly recovering from years of neglect and stress, the gray pallor replaced with something closer to the vitality Marcus remembered from when they first met. The children had adjusted to their new life with the resilience that children possess, their trauma not erased but managed with therapy and stability and the security of knowing they'd never be hungry again, that their mother would receive the medical care she needed, that their father wasn't going anywhere. Devon had finally, tentatively, started calling Marcus Dad, the word still feeling strange in his mouth but becoming more natural with each use. Dante's anger had mellowed into normal childhood moodiness, his relationship with his father growing stronger through shared activities and patient conversations, and Marcus's consistent presence that proved he really wasn't going to leave. Desiree had blossomed in the security of a complete family, her peacemaker tendencies easing as she realized she didn't have to hold everything together anymore, that the adult could handle their own relationships and she could just be a child. Marcus and Elise had taken things slowly, rebuilding their relationship with a caution of people who'd been hurt before and wanted to avoid repeating past mistakes, attending couples therapy and having difficult conversations and slowly, carefully, falling in love again or perhaps for the first time without lies between them. The triplets had been thrilled when their parents officially announced they were together, that they were going to try to build a real relationship and maybe, someday, get married and make their family legal in every sense. The proposal, when it came a year after their reunion, was simple and private, just the five of them in the penthouse with Marcus kneeling before Elise and 3 children holding their breath, asking her to marry him not because they had to, not because of the children, but because he loved her and wanted to spend whatever time they had left building a life together. She'd said yes through tears, and the children had erupted in cheers, and for the first time since this whole journey began, everything felt not just hopeful but actually, genuinely happy. The wedding was small and meaningful, attended by close friends and family who'd supported them through the difficult months of adjustment and healing, a celebration not just of Marcus and Elise's love, but of a family that had found its way back together against all odds. The triplets stood up with their parents, all 3 of them glowing with pride and joy, all 3 of them finally secure in the knowledge that they had both parents, that they were loved and wanted and would never again have to steal food or worry about keeping a roof over their heads. During the ceremony, when the efficient talk about families being built not just through biology but through choice and commitment and the daily work of showing up for each other, all 5 members of this reunited family cried, understanding in their bones that they'd been given something precious and rare, a second chance, an opportunity to heal what had been broken, a future that could be different from the past that had nearly destroyed them all. As they posed for family photos after the ceremony, Marcus holding Elise close while the triplets clustered around them, someone commented that they looked like they'd always been together, like a family that had never been separated at all. But they all knew better, knew that the separation and suffering were part of their story too, part of what had taught them to value what they'd found, part of what made this moment so precious precisely because they understood how easily it might never have happened at all. And if anyone had told them a year ago that a stolen lunch and wallet would lead to this, to healing and family and love, none of them would have believed it. But sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes desperation opens doors that would have stayed closed forever. And sometimes the families we create through forgiveness and choice are even stronger than the ones we're simply born into, bound together not just by blood but by the shared experience of being broken and choosing every single day to keep working toward wholeness. 6 months later, the penthouse had transformed from Marcus's sterile bachelor space into something that actually resembled a home, with children's toys scattered in corners and family photos adorning walls and the beautiful chaos that comes from 3 energetic children filling previously empty spaces with life and noise and the kind of joy that money can never buy but stability can nature. Elise's health had stabilized dramatically with proper medical care, expensive medications, nutritious food, and the kind of rest that's only possible when you're not working 3 jobs and worrying about eviction notices. The gray pallor that had made her look like a ghost had been replaced with genuine color and vitality, her body slowly recovering from years of neglect and stress, and the grinding poverty that kills people just as surely as any disease. The children had adjusted to their new life with the remarkable resilience that children possess when given safety and consistency, their trauma not erased but managed through weekly therapy sessions, patient conversations, and the security of knowing they'd never be hungry again, never have to steal, never have to watch their mother collapse from exhaustion and untreated illness. Devin had finally, tentatively, started calling Marcus Dad instead of using his first name, the word still feeling strange in his mouth but becoming more natural with each use, each shared moment, each promise kept. Dante's explosive anger had mellowed into normal childhood moodiness and occasional bratty behavior, his relationship with his father growing stronger through shared basketball games, homework help, and Marcus's consistent presence that proved he really wasn't going anywhere no matter how difficult things got. Desiree had blossomed in the security of having a complete family, her compulsive peacemaker tendencies easing as she realized she didn't have to hold everything together anymore, that the adults could handle their own complicated relationship, and she could simply be a child who played and laughed and occasionally threw tantrums without worrying that everything would fall apart. Marcus and Elise had taken things slowly and carefully, rebuilding their relationship with a caution of people who'd been badly hurt before and desperately wanted to avoid repeating past mistakes that had nearly destroyed them both. They attended couples therapy every week, sitting on a comfortable couch and unpacking years of hurt and misunderstanding and complicated choices with a professional who helped them see each other's perspectives without judgment or blame. They had difficult conversations late at night after the children were asleep, talking through their individual traumas and shared grief and the question of whether they could really build something lasting or if they were just co-parent pretending at romance because it would be convenient for the children. They went on actual dates, awkward at first because so much had changed and they were essentially strangers who happened to share 3 children and a complicated history. But slowly, carefully, honestly, they fell in love again, or perhaps for the first time without lies and secret between them, without the shadow of his dying wife or her justified anger or the weight of all the things left unsaid. This love felt different from their passionate affair 9 years ago, less intoxicating but more solid, built on truth and mutual respect and the shared commitment to being better people than they'd been before. When Marcus finally proposed 8 months after their reunion, he did it simply and privately, just the 5 of them in the penthouse on an ordinary Tuesday evening. He knelt before Elise while 3 children held their breath and watched with hope blazing in their eyes, asking her to marry him not because of obligation or convenience or because society expected it, but because he genuinely loved her and wanted to spend whatever time they had left building a real life together, creating the family they should have been from the beginning. Elise said yes through tears that streamed down her face and dripped onto the simple but beautiful ring Marcus had chosen with Desiree's help, and the children erupted in cheers so loud the neighbors probably heard them through the expensive soundproofing. They piled onto their parents in a group hug that knocked everyone slightly off balance, all 5 of them laughing and crying simultaneously, holding each other with a fierce grip of people who'd almost lost everything and understood exactly how precious this moment was. The wedding 6 months later was intimate and meaningful, held in the penthouse's rooftop garden with only close friends and the few family members who'd supported them through the difficult months of adjustment and healing. No expensive destination ceremony or society spectacle, just a simple celebration of 2 people who'd found their way back to each other and 3 children who'd finally gotten the complete family they'd always deserved. The triplets served as the entire wedding party, Devon holding the rings with solemn importance, Dante walking his mother down the short aisle with pride written across his face, Desiree scattering flower petals with such enthusiasm that everyone laughed. During the ceremony, when the officiant spoke about families being built not just through biology but through choice and commitment and the daily work of showing up for each other even when it's hard, even when you're tired, even when old wounds ache, all 5 members of this reunited family cried openly, understanding in their bones that they'd been given something precious and rare. A second chance that most people never receive, an opportunity to heal what had been broken, a future that could be radically different from past that had nearly destroyed them all. As they posed for family photos after the ceremony, Marcus holding Elise close while the triplets clustered around them with genuine smiles that reached their eyes and erased the haunted look they'd carried for so long, the photographer commented that they looked like they'd always been together, like a family that had never experienced separation or suffering at all. But they all knew better, understood that the separation and struggle were essential parts of their story too, not obstacles to overcome and forget but experiences that had shaped them, taught them to value what they'd found, made this moment infinitely more precious precisely because they understood how easily it might never have happened at all. Devon sometimes still had nightmares about being hungry, about watching his mother collapse, about the desperate fear that day they'd stolen from a stranger who turned out to be the answer to prayers they'd been too afraid to voice. Dante occasionally tested boundaries with defiant behavior born from years of feeling abandoned and unworthy, needing repeated reassurance that his father wouldn't leave even when he was difficult or angry or imperfect. Desiree still worried obsessively whenever her mother seemed tired, her young mind unable to completely release the terror that illness would return and steal away their happiness as quickly as it had arrived. Marcus carried guilt about the 9 years he'd missed, the milestones he'd never witnessed, the suffering he could have prevented if only he'd known, if only Elise had trusted him enough to tell him, if only he hadn't lied in the first place and created the circumstances that made everything else inevitable. Elise struggled with accepting help and depending on someone else after years of fierce independence born from necessity, sometimes pushing Marcus away when old fears whispered that trusting him would lead to betrayal, that this happiness was temporary and would be stolen away just like everything else good in her life had been. But they worked through it together, all 5 of them showing up for family therapy and individual counseling and the hard daily work of choosing to be a family even when it wasn't easy, even when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, even when the past threatened to poison the present. And slowly, day by day, they built something real and lasting, not a fairy tale where everything was magically fixed, but an authentic family held together by love and forgiveness and the conscious choice to keep trying. The triplets thrived in their new schools, making friends and joining activities and experiencing the kind of carefree childhood they'd been denied for so long. Eliza's health continued to improve until she was strong enough to volunteer at a community center, helping other struggling single mothers navigate the systems and resources she'd once desperately needed, turning her pain into purpose. Marcus scaled back his business commitments to be present for school plays and homework help and family dinners, discovering that the empire he'd built meant nothing compared to the laughter of his children and the warmth of Eliza's hand in his. They created new traditions and celebrated holidays with the enthusiasm of people making up for lost time, filling their home with the kind of memories that heal old wounds and write new stories over painful histories. And if anyone had told them 2 years ago that 3 desperate children stealing a billionaire's lunch would lead to this, to healing and wholeness and a family bound together by choice as much as blood, none of them would have believed it possible. But sometimes the worst moments crack open space for the best outcomes. Sometimes desperation opens doors that would have stayed locked forever, and sometimes the families we create through forgiveness and conscious commitment are even stronger than the ones we're simply born into. Held together not just by shared DNA, but by shared struggle and the daily decision to love each other through the mess and complications and beautiful imperfection of being human together.